Welcome to the 156th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Paul Doiron, author of the Mike Bowditch mystery series. This interview was recorded live at the Crime Bait Conference in Boston, Massachusetts. Stay tuned for my interview with Paul Doiron. The Reading and Writing Podcast is sponsored by the book-loving nerds at Riffle. Riffle is an online book community that connects readers with authors and books that they'll love. Readers use Riffle to find the next book that they want to read. And authors use Riffle to make their books stand out and drive sales. Join the Riffle community today at rifflebooks.com. That's rifflebooks.com. And look for the link in the show notes as well. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Paul Doiron, the author of the Mike Bowditch mystery novels, a series of mystery novels featuring Mike Bowditch, a Maine game warden. Massacre Pond, the latest book in the series, was published in July. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Sure. Well, for those listeners who haven't read Massacre Pond yet, how would you describe the novel?
Well, it's an unconventional murder mystery in the sense that the initial murder is the murder of moose. And it's actually 10 moose, which is makes sense in terms of what my protagonist does, which is he's a game warden. Mm-hmm. And game wardens in Maine are actually fully vested law enforcement officers. However, most of the cases that they work are wildlife crimes and, boating accidents and that sorts of things. So my editor had been pushing me for a long time to try to do a story that connected with what wardens truly do. Mm-hmm. And this one presented itself. So
great. Well, when you wrote your first Mike Bowditch novel, The Poachers Son, did you know you wanted to write a mystery novel? And did you find the character of Mike Bowditch in the process, or did you start out knowing you wanted to write about a game warden?
You know what? Actually, I started out with an incident. I'm a journalist by trade, and I'd been writing short features for a magazine that I was working for, and there was a bear in one of the nearby towns that was roaming around from farm to farm killing pigs, and it was only killing pigs and eating them. And I just found it fascinating for reasons I don't even understand today. So I wrote a little item about it. And then one day I went home and I found myself writing just a little vignette from the point of view of that warden. And from that, it sort of began to grow in the sense that the warden was at the crime scene. The farmer is reporting his dead pig. The warden then returns home, and I know nothing about him. And he has a phone call, a message on his voice machine. Who is it from? It turns out to be from his father. I know nothing about who the father is. I don't even know this character has a father. The father says, I need help. And it really sort of took off organically, I think, from there, where, one scene led to another, led to sort of more questions in my own mind about the character. And then, I knew that there was obviously the potential to write a series about this person, at least professionally, in the sense that game wardens are involved with so many crimes in the state of Maine. I mean, they're involved with not just the things that we think of as sort of the work of fish and game people. I mean, poaching and that
right.
sort of thing. In Maine, a game warden is fully vested with all the powers of a state trooper and will investigate all crimes, from littering to murder. Now, they're usually at a certain point in a murder investigation, of course, they're pushed aside for the state police detectives. But it definitely struck me that this was a ripe area.
And you mentioned you had written nonfiction before that.
Yes.
Was that when you started writing that vignette about, inspired by this bear incident?
Mm-hmm.
Had you written fiction prior to that?
Yeah, I had. I mean, I've always wanted to be a novelist. It's been my lifelong dream. And I think that it was a great case in my life of wanting to write fiction and having nothing to write about. And then in my 30s, things began to kind of come together. I've always been an outdoorsman. I've always been passionately interested in fishing and hunting and the woods in general, just nature, the birds that are singing, the mushrooms that I'm seeing, that sort of thing. But I never saw it really as the stuff of fiction. And in fact, for a long time, I didn't even think that it was a viable subject. And then something happened that I began to realize that, this is actually what I have to write about, is the Maine that I know and closely observe. The question is in what format and what kind of genre.
Right.
I went to Yale. I studied with the deconstructionists. I come from a very formal literary background. My classmates are very well regarded, potential Nobel Prize winning writers, Chang-Rae Lee and Claire Massoud and Andrew Solomon, all these great writers. But at some point, I think, I came to the conclusion that, no, that's not me. I like mysteries, and I respect mysteries, and want to write them. And I want to write them well. I think that a crime novel can be a work of literature. I think, as I've often said to people, more readers turn to Raymond Chandler today than they do to John O'Hara. They were both writing at the same time.
Right.
One had a certain reputation. The other was thought of as being kind of a pulp writer. And yet Chandler has endured in a way that O'Hara hasn't, frankly.
Right. And so what was when you finished that first novel, the Poachers Son, what was the path to publication like? Did you already have an agent, or did you?
I did not. To simplify a very complicated story, and every path to publication, I think, is a complicated story, at least for most writers, I would imagine. I wrote the book and I revised it many times until I had a completed manuscript that I thought was maybe ready to go out. And I gave it actually to an ex-girlfriend, which, is especially dangerous for lots of reasons. She was not in it in any way, shape, or form, which is probably why I was willing to share it with her. But she's a really excellent writer, and I really respect her opinion. And she read the book, and she said, I think you should send this to Dennis Lehane's agent. And which took me by surprise. I respect Lehane a whole lot. I think he's a fantastic writer and talent. But I don't write like Dennis Lehane in any way. Turns out she was in a writing group with Dennis Lehane. And I think that what she was saying was that my book didn't remind her of Dennis Lehane, but that I personally reminded her of Dennis Lehane. So I found out who Dennis Lehane's agent was and approached her through various means. And it turns out actually she was interested in the book. She has a connection to the state of Maine, so that was really helpful for me. But, obviously when you write something, there are no real tricks. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, if you're Snooky, there you can vault over things, Lauren Conrad or whatever. But for the rest of us, we have to go by the rules, and you have to have a book that stands on its own.
Sure. Well, for the novels that you're writing, how much research do you have to do? I mean, you obviously said that you're an outdoorsman already. Do you do much research, or do you have anybody in law enforcement look at the book?
I don't have anybody look at it. I would say that my research falls into two categories, and one is personal, which is to say that I spend a lot of time outdoors, so that I could tell you in a given month, for instance, let's take the month of May, that in Maine, that you're more likely to see and hear palm and prairie warblers early in the month. And then late in the month, you're more likely to see blackpoll warblers. So these are things that I just know from being outdoors. But there's a whole lot of issues that come into the books that I don't know anything about personally. I'm not a law enforcement officer, and I've tried to study the Maine Criminal Code and that sort of thing. But there's lots of discretion that's applied or not applied. So I've cultivated relationships, good relationships with the warden service, individual wardens, retired wardens, fish and wildlife biologists, attorneys, those sorts of things. And that, I think, is really that's me being the journalist,
right?
Where I'm doing sort of the shoe leather reporting.
Sure. So I know you mentioned earlier that you taught this class yesterday about pacing.
Yes.
So any broad kind of tips? I mean, I know you spoke for like an hour or so, but any kind of basic tips on pacing for mystery or?
Yeah. Well, and pacing is an interesting topic, and I was happy to discuss it because it's crucial to the telling of any story. It's, when I started by comparing it to tempo in music, which is that, when a composer writes a piece of music, they decide, at what speed they want their audience to experience it. And it's the same thing, I think, for pacing in writing, which is that it's the writer guiding the reader's experience. How do you want to read this book? At what point do you want information? At what point do you stop wanting information and really want action and dialogue? How do you get exposition into the mix? At what point should you stop doing that? We all have the experience, especially with mystery novels, I think, of getting to a point in a book where we begin to skip pages. It's like I don't need to. What happened? And so I think it's really incumbent upon the writer to be have a lot of self-knowledge about how your reader is reading you, and to take responsibility of their experience. And of course, we all want to be entertained and educated as well.
Sure.
But when you have reached the point where you really just want to be entertained, you sort of stop wanting probably to be educated too. Right. That's not my time to tell you the difference between a 12 gauge shotgun and a 410 shotgun. I should have done that chapters earlier.
Right. And so is that something that as you're writing, I mean, in terms of the structure and plot, I mean, is that something that you find yourself, if you're reading a draft or reading a first draft, is it something where you look at specific pacing and say, maybe I should not do as much exposition here in this scene?
Well, the way that I actually write my first drafts is quickly, for one thing. But also organically, in the sense that if I decide I'm sort of pulled into a tangent, on to, I'm trying to think what I just was working on the other day. There was something that I went on for a lot. I found myself going on for paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and it wasn't necessarily, advancing the plot. It was actually, you know what it was? It was about the way that small boys talk to cops about their guns. And this is based on conversations I've had with police officers, which is that, a cop will go into a school and want to talk about all sorts of different things, and the boys are only interested in the guns. And so this turned into 3 or 4 paragraphs of what was essentially exposition. And I let myself go with it. I very soon found myself in a chapter in which it was a lot of dialogue. When I write dialogue in the first draft, I don't pause to add lots of details about somebody scratching their chin or all those sorts of things. I write the dialogue fast. I write action fast. I think that the way that the writer writes, the pace at which the writer writes can then transfer itself into the way that the reader experiences the work of fiction. So, I want to make sure that when I am writing, the climax of the book,
right,
that I'm as eager to get to the end as the reader is. Yeah.
Gotcha. And how much plotting do you do beforehand? I mean, do you know, kind of the ending before you start?
I know the ending. I would say that's probably the only thing that I know. I've been forced. The publishing industry likes synopses.
Yeah.
And if you want to have a career, you find yourself having to write them in order to get new contracts and that sorts of things. So I've gotten into the habit of learning how to write a 5,000 word description of the action, and I have to say.
And does the book that you end up writing, I mean, do you ever turn it in and like the editor says, that's not the synopsis I read?
Yes and no. What I try to do is I try to use it actually as a rough guide for myself. I've enjoyed actually, starting to use them because I had always thought that a book, and still believe actually, that a book needs to be organic.
Right.
That if I'm not surprised, the reader's not going to be surprised. But I also find that in order for me to have a little bit of, to not roam off in weird directions across the prairie, having some idea of where I'm headed is not a bad idea. Yeah. So I think it really is like, having a map in front of you and saying, okay, I'm traveling from Maine to Dedham, Massachusetts. I know I need to be at Dedham,
right,
but which way do I want to go?
Exactly.
I have all kinds of options at my disposal. So
Sure. So what are you working on now?
I'm working on the 5th Mike Bowditch book. It's called The Bone Orchard, and it takes place. Let me think. How many years? About a year. A little bit less than a year after Massacre Pond. What intrigues me about working on this series is that I really went into it, once I decided that I was going to be writing a series, from the standpoint that the character was going to grow and change and mature from book to book. And so when I think of a new book, it's less about, this is a great it's hook. It's less of a, it's not high concept. It's more where is Mike now? Where would Mike be now?
Right.
And what's the best story to convey his growth as a person and as a character?
Right. So what books and authors have you read recently, either fiction or nonfiction, or it doesn't have to be mystery, that impressed you that you would possibly recommend?
When I'm sort of in the thick of writing, I have a real problem reading fiction in the sense that if I read something that's really good, I start to copy it. I acquire. It's like the Woody Allen movie Zelig, where you sort of begin to mimic somebody else's style. On the other hand, I think it's really important for novelists to keep reading. I mean, reading is sort of the first step to writing. So I've been reading actually a few things recently. I read Canada by Richard Ford. Very impressed by it. Really, and actually I thought it was really applicable in a way to what I'm doing as well. In his descriptions of country and characters and that sorts of things. I've also read, the Joe Nesbo books. I'm catching up on Joe Nesbo just because he's hot, and I think that's one of those things. I think you feel like you have to sort of know what the market is, where it's going, sure. And he's very entertaining, actually, and I don't know that he provides me a whole lot of guidance in terms of what I'm trying to do, but I recommend his books.
Great. Well, thanks again. We've been speaking with Paul Doiron, the author of the Mike Bowditch mystery novels. Massacre Pond is the latest book in the series, and it's in bookstores now, so grab a copy. Paul, thanks for doing the interview.
I'm pleased to have done it. Thank you.
Great.